My son left me in a wheelchair at the hospital doors, his words echoing, "You're nothing but a burden." My chest tightened as the sliding doors shut behind him, until I looked up and saw a familiar figure waiting by a sleek black car. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. I never thought my own son would look me in the eye and call me useless. But at 70 years old, sitting in a wheelchair with my hospital bracelets still around my wrist, I heard the words, "Mom, you're nothing but a burden. You'll drag me down." The syllables hit like cold steel against my chest, slicing deeper than any scalpel the doctors had used hours earlier. My hands, thin and trembling, clutched the edge of the chair as though holding on could keep the world from collapsing. I wanted to believe I'd misheard him, that perhaps my medication was clouding my ears. But the certainty in his tone was sharper than the antiseptic air that filled the hospital corridor. That was Daniel, my only child, turning his back on me. He didn't even wait for my response. No pause for a plea, no chance for me to defend myself or remind him of the decades I had spent carrying him through storms he couldn't remember. He simply pivoted on his polished shoes and walked away, his broad shoulders framed by the hospital's sliding glass doors as they opened with a mechanical sigh. Then they closed behind him, sealing me inside a silence more deafening than any noise. The nurse beside me shifted awkwardly, pretending to study her clipboard. Her face betrayed a flicker of pity, but she said nothing. Perhaps she had seen this before, elderly mothers discarded like worn coats in the winter. I wanted her to speak, to tell me this wasn't happening, that my son would return through those doors, eyes soft, voice apologetic. But she remained silent, and her silence was confirmation enough. I sat there abandoned, humiliated, and broken. The hospital lobby buzzed around me, phones ringing at the front desk, doctors in scrubs rushing past with charts, the faint echo of a code being announced over the intercom. But I was an island no one approached. People glanced at me, some with curiosity, others with embarrassment, but no one dared to ask why an old woman sat motionless in a wheelchair, her hands shaking as if she were trying to hold together the pieces of a shattered heart. The humiliation stung worse than the pain in my body. This wasn't just about being left alone in a sterile place of strangers. It was about being discarded by the very person I had given my life to raise. I remembered Daniel as a boy, clutching my hand as he crossed the street, his small fingers tight with trust. I remembered the way he used to call out, "Mom," whenever he fell, confident that I would always be there to lift him, dust off his knees, and kiss away the hurt. And yet, here I was, the same mother, discarded like yesterday's newspaper. My mind raced back through the years, clinging to images of sacrifices Daniel would never see. Nights spent awake after working a 14-hour shift, sewing buttons back on his school shirts so he wouldn't be teased. Winters when I gave him the only warm coat we had, telling him I didn't need one because mothers don't feel the cold. Birthdays when I skipped meals for weeks just to afford a small cake with his favorite chocolate frosting. I had given him everything, my youth, my health, my dreams, and all I wanted in return was the simplest of gestures. Respect, a little kindness, the assurance that I mattered. Instead, I received abandonment. The bracelet on my wrist, stamped with my name and age, felt like a cruel tag marking me as useless inventory. I imagined the nurses and orderlies seeing me not as Megan, the woman who once worked 3 jobs to raise her son, but as patient 70, female, no family contact. The thought hollowed me out further. Was this how it ended? After 70 years of fighting for life, of enduring storms and surviving losses, was I now reduced to a burden, left behind at the very place designed to preserve life? Tears welled but refused to fall. Pride held them back. If Daniel wanted to see me crumble, he would not have that satisfaction. I sat upright, even as my bones ached and my chest trembled with the weight of betrayal. A group of visitors passed by, their laughter echoing through the lobby as they carried balloons and flowers for a newborn. I followed them with my eyes, and a painful contrast settled in my chest. New life celebrated, while old life was pushed aside. Mothers celebrated at the beginning, mothers forgotten at the end. Minutes stretched into hours. Each second without Daniel's return pressed deeper into my chest, solidifying the truth. He wasn't coming back. He had made his choice, and it was final. The sliding doors opened again, letting in a gust of cold evening air. For a brief moment, hope fluttered inside me. Maybe he had come back. Maybe regret had softened his heart. But it was only another stranger, walking past me without even a glance. Hope sank like a stone into the pit of my stomach, leaving me heavier than before. I clutched my thin hospital blanket tighter around my shoulders, though it did little to ward off the chill creeping into my bones. I whispered into the emptiness, my voice barely audible over the hum of the fluorescent lights. "How could you, Daniel? How could you leave me like this?" The words vanished into the sterile air, swallowed by the hospital's indifference. And for the first time in 70 years, I felt not like a mother, but like an abandoned shell of one. Tears burned as memories of sacrifice came flooding back. I raised Daniel alone after his father's sudden death, and the years that followed were stitched together by necessity and willpower. Grief didn't wait for me to finish crying. It tapped me on the shoulder before dawn and told me to get up for work. I learned the habits of 3 lives at once. By day, I scrubbed baseboards on my knees in houses that smelled of lemon oil and fresh lilies, rooms I could never afford to live in, mirrors so spotless I could see every crease that worry had carved into my face. I kept a toothbrush in my pocket for grout lines and a rag soaked in vinegar for stainless steel smudges. At night, I tied on a faded apron at the Bluebird Diner and poured coffee until midnight, fingers pruned by dishwater, hair steeped in the perfume of fried onions. On weekends, while other mothers stood in sunlit windows, I bent over my second-hand Singer machine and fed it hems and tears, the needle ticking like a watch I couldn't afford to own. I charged $1 for patches, $2 for a quick fix, $5 for prom dress miracles no one else could pull off overnight. Every dollar had a destination. I kept a mayonnaise jar on the counter with a strip of masking tape that read Daniel's future, and I watched coins become crumpled bills, then crisp ones, then, once or twice, a check from a customer who insisted on paying more because no one works like you anymore, Megan. When Daniel was sick, I learned the rituals of fear. I'd fill a bowl with cool water and rest the washcloth on his forehead, counting breaths in the dim blue light of his night lamp shaped like a rocket ship. I'd run the shower hot until steam wrapped the bathroom in a cloud so thick I could pretend we lived in a place where air was gentle and lungs didn't wheeze. I told him stories, not the made-up kind, but the ones about who he was. The boy who could take things apart and put them back together. The kid who outran thunder on his scooter and brought home worms in his pockets after rainstorms because he didn't want them to be lonely. Sometimes I nodded off in the chair by his bed, waking when the floorboard near the door creaked under the weight of a life I hadn't planned but refused to abandon. I measured our progress in bus transfers and grocery receipts and the way he grew out of his shoes too fast. Once, when his sneakers split along the sole, I stitched them from the inside and sealed them with glue, then used a black marker to hide the surgery. He won his first middle school race in those shoes, crossing the finish line with his arms flung out like he might catch the whole sky. I cheered so hard my voice broke, and afterward he pressed his ear to my chest and said he could hear my heart banging around like it was trying to escape. "It's strong for you," I told him, half joking, wholly true. I made mistakes, the kind born not of neglect but of hunger for his better life. I praised his ambition like it was prayer. I told him to reach and keep reaching, to step where the floor looked polished and never apologize for entering rooms where people didn't expect him. I ironed his shirts for debate tournaments until the cotton shone. I learned to knot a tie from a library DVD and practiced on my own reflection until my fingers understood the logic of fabric. When he asked for a test prep course I couldn't afford, I opened the velvet box in the top dresser drawer and stared at the ring that had once been my promise. I sold it to a woman who promised her daughter would cherish it. The money paid for the course and half a used laptop. My finger felt naked for a while. Eventually, it just felt light. We ate what coupons allowed. I learned the map of the grocery store better than my own neighborhood. End caps for loss leaders, bottom shelves for the brands that didn't pretend to be better than they were. Daniel made a game of it when he was little. How low can we go today? And I laughed with him so he wouldn't notice me doing math under my breath. When the fridge hummed at night, it sounded like it was singing a lullaby from a richer house, but it sang for us anyway. He grew into himself the way plants find light. Teachers sent notes home with words like promise and potential, and I pinned them to a corkboard above the kitchen table like badges. I sat through parent-teacher conferences with my hands clenched in my lap, afraid they'd smell the cleaner on my skin and hold it against him. They didn't. They spoke about scholarships and leadership and the way his mind could outrun his mouth sometimes. I tucked every compliment into my pocket and brought it to work, smoothing the paper when breaks were allowed, letting the words fuel another hour, another order, another hymn. But ambition, once it starts running, doesn't always look back. In high school, Daniel stopped asking me to come to certain things. A banquet here, an awards night there. It's fine, Mom. It's small. Don't miss work. He said it kindly at first. Then he said it quickly. Once, when I showed up anyway, I saw him notice the shine of my diner shoes before he noticed me. He hugged me tight, but his eyes slid over my uniform like it embarrassed him. After, he asked me not to wear it when I came to campus. I told myself it was teenage pride, temporary, a stage like all the others. Still that night, I scrubbed the apron twice and hung it in the back of the closet, as if hiding it could hide the life that required it. He wanted things I couldn't always give on time. Brand name cleats, the jacket everyone wore, a graphing calculator that cost as much as a week of groceries. I found ways. I bartered extra sewing for a neighbor who worked retail and saved me her employee discount. I delivered pies for the diner on holidays, my breath fogging the windshield, while carols played from a station that promised no commercials, just cheer, and I whispered, let him never know this part. Not because I was ashamed of the labor, but because I wanted him to believe the world could be easier than it had been for me. I pushed him toward a future where he wouldn't have to learn the names of chemicals strong enough to bleach despair out of tile. I taught him to look people in the eye and shake hands with a grip that said he belonged. I told him not to apologize for wanting more. What I didn't teach him, what I didn't know how to teach him, was how not to despise the less he came from. I hear my own voice in his, sometimes when it turns hard. Don't look back. Keep moving. I meant don't let grief swallow you. He heard, don't let me slow you down. College acceptance came in a thick envelope that thudded against the floor when it slipped through our mail slot. He whooped and spun me around the kitchen, and for one perfect minute we were the team we had always been. Then the minute ended, and letters about tuition and housing and fees piled up on the table like a second job. I took more shifts. I applied for a grant meant for women re-entering the workforce, as if I had ever left it. We argued one night about whether he should work part-time his first semester. I said it would build character. He said it would break momentum. We both believed we were protecting the same dream. He learned fluency in rooms where I was illiterate. Forks I didn't know names for. Words that folded old ones into new ones until I wasn't sure what anyone meant when they said network. He began to correct my pronunciation of things I'd learned from books instead of teachers. It stung more than it should have. I told myself he was sharpening himself on the world, but sometimes the whetstone looked like me. When he came home, he brought friends who smelled like cologne I couldn't afford to sniff for long. I kept the table full and the conversation light. He winced once when I dropped my R's, a habit from my own mother I'd never been able to iron out. After they left, he apologized. "Mom, I just want you to fit in." I said I'd try. That night I practiced saying car into a teacup as if it could echo me back better, a private lesson with no tuition and no progress. I saved what could be saved. I let go of what couldn't. I told myself love absorbs the blows ambition doesn't see coming. I believed effort could translate into gratitude as if they shared a language. But somewhere along the way, my sacrifices became invisible. They did not vanish. They simply turned transparent, like breath on a cold day. There, undeniable, then gone before anyone could swear it had existed. Daniel began to look at me with the same polite, distant strangers use when someone thanks them too eagerly. He saw the version of me that made his future possible and mistook it for the past he needed to outrun. I did not stop loving him. I learned to carry love like a heavy bag, held close to the body so it doesn't strain the arms. He once asked me what I wanted for myself, and I said the wrong thing. You. I should have said respect. I should have said a seat that isn't in the shadows. But mothers translate their desires into their children's futures until the grammar of self disappears. By the time I tried to conjugate differently, he'd grown fluent in another tongue, the one that calls survival status, the one that confuses distance with safety. To him, I became weight. To me, he remained the boy who fell asleep mid-sentence and trusted my voice to finish the story. Both could be true. Only one was visible. And in the ledger where life tallies what it thinks it owes, visibility counts more than effort. A nurse finally pushed my wheelchair to the exit, and the doors opened with a startled hiss, as if the building itself disapproved of letting me go. Pete rushed at me, a slap of noon air that smelled of tar and faint jasmine from a planter someone watered out of habit. The sunlight was not kind. It flattened everything, pressed the color out of faces, made the world look honest and unadorned. My eyes watered, whether from the glare or the ache in my chest I couldn't tell. Behind me, the hospital's thermostat hum and disinfectant breath gave way to street noise, an ambulance idling somewhere unseen, a bus sighing at the curb, the thin electric chirp of the crosswalk counting down seconds no one listened to. "Here we are," the nurse said, voice small and efficient. She locked the chair's footbrakes with a heel click that made the metal complain. "Do you have someone to call?" The question hung there, a piece of lint she was obligated to pluck from a coat. I swallowed. The phone felt heavier in my pocket than it had a right to be. I nodded without nodding, and she took that for permission to disappear. The doors sealed behind her, the cool artificial air cut off like a withheld apology. Alone on the threshold, I became aware of my body as a map of negotiations, hip-stitched with ache, wrists thin as wishbones, the steady drum of my heart insisting on relevance. The bracelet around it flashed my name back at me in block letters. Megan, 70. I pulled the blanket closer, a flimsy shield against the sun that showed every threadbare place I'd ignored. Where would I go? Who would I call? Questions multiplied like sparrows on a wire, fast and fidgety, impossible to quiet. I tried to imagine dialing Daniel. My thumb knew the path to his name by memory, the way an old farmer's hand knows the latch of a gate in the dark. I pictured his face when he said burden, the way the word sat cleanly in his mouth, as if it had been rinsed and set out on a towel to dry. My pulse stumbled. I pressed the foam against my thigh instead, as if proximity could substitute for courage. The sidewalk shone in lanes where someone had recently scrubbed away last night's gum and spills. A volunteer rolled a cart past with plastic cups of water sweating in their sleeves, and the scent of chlorine and paper straws moved with him. A child cried 2 blocks away, a thin, indignant wail, and was answered by a voice layered with promises that everything would be okay. I remembered saying those words to Daniel, not as a lie, but as a working theory, something you repeat until the world agrees. I wiped my eyes and looked up because I needed a horizon line to steady myself. That's when I saw him. He stood just beyond the curb, anchored in a patch of shadow cast by a hospital elm that had learned, miraculously, to grow in a box of dirt smaller than a coffin. A sleek black car idled beside him. Paint so polished it caught the sky and turned it to liquid. He leaned one shoulder against the door as if it had been designed for him. The pose casual until you noticed the rest of him was not. The jaw set like someone holding his breath under cold water, the hand on the roof flexing and releasing, the eyes fixed on me with something that swam between disbelief and sorrow. Time did not stop, not exactly. It slowed its walk and turned to listen. At first, my mind did what minds do when the past walks toward you wearing a body you thought you'd never see again. It made a catalog of resemblance and difference. The hair, darker than it should be at his age, but streaked at the temples where our father went silver first. The mouth, our mother's underline, softened at the corners by years of telling stories too late at night. The height unchanged, but the posture altered. Once he'd stood with a spring-loaded readiness, a slingshot of a man. Now there was a gravity to him, a measuredness that read as both earned and fragile. The suit fit him the way music fits a room it was written for. Clean lines, no apology. And yet the eyes. Oh God, the eyes were my brother's from a lifetime ago, the ones that used to flash at me across a kitchen table when he dared me not to laugh at the worst moments. Those eyes had no business being here, cutting through sorry and sun glare, and my disbelief like they knew the way. My breath caught somewhere high in my chest, a snag in fabric. Michael. The name arrived before permission, a bird that finds its way home by landmarks you can't see. The last time I had spoken it aloud, the syllables had been dressed in anger and fear, and a kind of desperate prayer that he would either stay and be saved or go and be safe. Years had made a graveyard of that day and planted a hedge around it so thick I couldn't see over. Now the hedge parted, and there he was, breathing. I didn't move. Movement would make the moment collapse one way or another. It would turn miracle into logistics. The chair's wheels were locked. My bones were heavier than they had been 10 minutes ago. Still, the urge to stand and run collared my throat. How many times had I rehearsed this encounter in dreams I woke from shaking? In those rehearsals, I was younger, the seasons were softer, and he arrived with a laugh and an apology and a pocket full of exact change for everything he'd cost me. Reality is not rehearsed. It stumbles in with scuffed shoes and a noise of engines and a hospital bracelet that says you are not who you once were. He didn't wave. He didn't speak. He looked at me as if I were the only thing in the frame that made sense, as if all the lines of his days had been drawing him to this particular geometry. Woman in wheelchair, August sun, a door that will not open backwards. His gaze moved once, briefly, to the bracelet, to the tremor of the blanket at my knee, to the empty space beside me where a son should have stood. Then it returned to my face and stayed there, steadying me more than the brakes at my feet. Memory, unreliable as it is, began to spool in curated flashes. 2 kids on a summer porch breaking popsicles in half and arguing over who got the bigger piece, both pretending not to see our mother watching from the screen door with a smile she'd deny. Michael teaching me to ride a bike on a street with more gravel than good sense, running behind me with a hand at the back of the seat until he let go, and I didn't notice because I was too busy flying. The shark musk of our father's garage, damp newspapers spread under an engine part that wasn't ours to fix, but would be by supper time. Then the darker reels. A slammed door, the back of a jacket, dust held in the light like a constellation we could own if we named it fast enough. I gripped the armrest until my knuckles whitened, not out of fear, but to confirm the chair was real. A breeze startled the elm into a small applause. The car's engine purred, patient, like a large cat content to wait for humans to decide their business. I became aware of my heartbeat sensing to the machine's idle, low, steady, insistent. Two grown people on opposite sides of a short stretch of pavement and years, studying each other as if translation were possible. A volunteer approached with a clipboard. "Do you need assistance crossing, ma'am?" he asked, kindness a reflex that stung only because it recognized the need I didn't want to wear. I shook my head, kept my eyes on Michael. The volunteer followed my gaze, made a soft "oh," and retreated the way people do when they accidentally interrupt a prayer. The sun climbed a fraction and shadow shifted over the car's hood, bending his reflection into a river version of himself. I watched him press his lips together the way he always had when he was about to make a choice. The air felt thinner. In the glass behind me, I could see my own outline, small, stubborn, braced for impact. All the rooms of our history stood up at once inside me, doors open, lights on. I did not know what his first word would be. I did not know what mine should. I only knew that the distance between us was measurable and could be crossed, that my name on the bracelet did not tell the whole story, that the part of me that refused to die had a familiar face standing in front of it. The chair creaked when I shifted forward, and the sound startled a sparrow from the elm. Its wings cut the air, a quick stutter. My throat worked around a syllable older than my grief, a sound that did not require consent from the years that had tried to erase it. "Michael," I breathed, no louder than the engine, like a key testing an old lock, not yet turning, but certain of the shape. Michael and I hadn't spoken in nearly 40 years, yet his presence stood before me like a door I'd thought locked forever, suddenly swung wide. Time had reshaped him, but not erased him. He was taller than memory had allowed, or maybe grief had made me smaller. His hair, darker than a man his age should have carried, was streaked silver at the temples, and his shoulders bore the deliberate strength of someone who had carried the weight of his own history. I remembered the boy he once was, all restless limbs and fire in his chest, never still long enough to belong anywhere. Now, the man who stepped forward moved with the caution of someone who had finally learned what it cost to run too fast. We had parted on words sharp enough to draw blood. Our last conversation had been a battle across the dinner table of our childhood home, voices rising over unpaid debts, over broken promises, over his refusal to bend to the family's rules. He had stormed out into the night with nothing but a duffel bag and the fury of youth, slamming the door so hard the panes rattled in their frames. For years after, his absence was filled with whispers. Rumors of bankruptcy, of schemes gone wrong, of nights wasted in places where names didn't matter. I let those rumors harden into belief. It was easier to think of him as broken than to hope for something better. Hope, after all, is a cruel creditor. But the man before me was not broken. The suit he wore was tailored to his frame, the fabric pressed so clean it seemed to resist the dust of the city itself. A watch gleamed on his wrist, its face catching the sunlight, a subtle but undeniable marker of success. His shoes, polished to a quiet mirror, belonged to a man who had walked into rooms where respect was not requested but expected. Yet for all the symbols of wealth and resilience, His eyes betrayed something else, a sorrow, a weight carried longer than any fortune could balance. Megan. His voice cracked on my name, and the sound carved through the years like a chisel, finding the old grain of wood beneath layers of paint. I came back for you. The words lodged in my chest. For decades I had imagined what his return might look like, if it ever came at all. Sometimes I pictured him swaggering, unrepentant, still chasing whatever dream had stolen him away. Other times I saw him ruined, hollow-eyed, begging for forgiveness I wasn't sure I could give. But this Michael, the one whose shoulders sagged as if from carrying a debt of the heart, whose eyes glistened with both joy and shame, was neither of those men. He was something rarer, someone who had been forged by distance, wealth, and regret, yet still remembered the shape of my name. He stepped closer, and his hand trembled before it found the armrest of my wheelchair. I saw the hesitation, the fear that I might recoil, that the years of silence had hardened into a wall too high to climb. But I did not pull back. My throat closed around every accusation I had rehearsed in lonely nights. 40 years of questions condensed into silence, and still his eyes kept speaking. I left, but I never stopped carrying you with me. He explained, halting at first, then with a steadiness that revealed how long he had rehearsed these words. Life had taken him abroad, where mistakes and missteps had nearly buried him. Yes, there had been failure, but there had also been grit, the kind of relentless effort that keeps a man alive long enough for fortune to change its mind. He had built something, an enterprise, a business that had grown from desperation into triumph. His success had been measured not just in profit, but in survival. And yet, through all the contracts and cities, through every banquet where laughter was served with wine, guilt shadowed him. I thought of you every night, he whispered, voice low enough that the words seemed meant only for the space between us. Every choice I made, every dollar I earned, I wondered what you would think, and I hated myself for not turning back sooner. But I told myself I'd come back when I had something to give you, something more than apologies. The world blurred, and I realized tears were sliding down my cheeks, hot as the sun on my skin. My brother, my lost, stubborn, infuriating brother, had returned at the very moment my son abandoned me. Fate has a cruel rhythm, but sometimes it composes a mercy in its dissonance. Daniel had cast me aside, yet Michael had stepped forward, carrying the kind of loyalty that time and distance had failed to bury. The irony struck me with a sharp, almost bitter clarity. My son, whom I had sacrificed everything for, saw me as a burden. My brother, whom I had nearly given up on, returned not only with resources, but with the one thing I needed most, proof that I was not invisible, not forgotten, not useless. The city moved around us, buses groaning, horns impatient, footsteps quickening to appointments. But in that moment, all of it receded into a muffled backdrop. The air between us was heavy with what had been lost and what might still be salvaged. His presence was a kind of anchor, keeping me from drifting completely into despair. I studied his face, searching for the boy I once knew. I saw him in the crease above his brow, in the way his mouth tightened when emotion threatened to spill, in the tenderness he tried and failed to disguise. 40 years had thickened his voice, deepened the lines of his face, but the essence of him, my brother who once swore he'd always protect me, remained intact. Michael. My own voice cracked, the syllables fragile but alive. In speaking his name, I felt something stir in me I hadn't felt in years. The possibility of being held, not just left behind. And in that fragile, sunlit moment, I realized that fate had chosen its stage well. The very doors that had closed on Daniel's betrayal had opened on Michael's return. The timing was brutal, almost theatrical, but it was undeniable. The brother I thought gone forever had come back, not to haunt me, not to demand, but to stand beside me when I needed someone most. The phone rang not long after Michael and I had exchanged those first fragile words, and the vibration against my thigh felt like a summons. I pulled it from my pocket with hands that trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of everything converging in this single moment. Daniel's name glowed on the screen, each letter sharp and merciless. My son, my betrayer. The one who had left me at the hospital door like a piece of furniture someone no longer wanted. I answered, though part of me wanted to let it ring until it withered. "Mom," Daniel said, his voice oiled with a concern so thin it nearly cracked under its own falseness. I hope you found somewhere to stay." The words were wrong from the start. Hope. He had no hope for me, only calculation. He wanted to know whether I had stumbled, whether I had called some distant cousin, begged a neighbor, or sat hunched in a shelter with the fluorescent lights burning through the night. He wanted confirmation that his cruelty had stuck, that his decision to discard me had taken root. It was the voice of someone checking the locks after committing a crime, not the voice of a son worried for his mother. I steadied my breath, pressing the phone tight against my ear. My gaze flicked to Michael, who stood beside me with the patience of a man who understood storms before they broke. "I'm not alone, Daniel," I said, my voice firm, steadier than I expected. "Your Uncle Michael is with me." The silence that followed was not silence at all. It was a vacuum, a sudden collapse of air that made the city's noise fall away. For a heartbeat, I thought the call had dropped. Then I heard it, a sharp inhale, jagged, torn through clenched teeth. "That's impossible," Daniel hissed, the veneer slipping, panic puncturing his practiced tone. "He's dead." The words landed like stones, each one heavy with disbelief and denial. To Daniel, Michael was a ghost, a rumor swallowed decades ago. He had lived his whole life without ever expecting that name to step out of the past and into his present. For him, Michael's return was not only improbable, it was dangerous. It meant the narrative Daniel had built, the one where his mother was weak and expendable, was about to collapse. Michael's hand extended toward me, palm open. I placed the phone in it without hesitation. His fingers brushed mine, steady, warm, unshaking, and then he brought the device to his ear. His voice, when it came, was calm, but calm in the way steel is calm. Unbending, forged by fire. "No, Daniel. I'm alive, and I know what you did to your mother." He paused, the silence deliberate, the kind that forces the other side to squirm. "You'll regret underestimating her." There was no raised volume, no theatrical rage. Just a steady, anchored truth that carried more weight than shouting ever could. I watched Michael's face as he spoke, eyes narrowed, jaw squared, every line in his expression homed to deliver not just words but judgment. On the other end, Daniel stuttered. The sound was faint, but I recognized it instantly. The quick, faltering trip of a man whose confidence had just cracked. For the first time in years, I heard fear in my son's voice. Real fear, not the nervous laughter of a boy caught in mischief, not the shallow panic of missing a deadline. This was deeper. The kind of fear that comes when the ground beneath you shifts and you realize you are no longer in control. I could almost picture him wherever he was, phone pressed to his ear, eyes darting, chest tight. Perhaps he stood in his pristine office, the polished desk suddenly smaller, the framed certificates behind him meaningless. Maybe he was in his car, parked with the engine running, fingers white-knuckled on the wheel. Wherever he was, Michael's words had reached him, slicing through his certainty like glass through cloth. "Uncle, I." Daniel's voice faltered again, then cut off. He was groping for words, for excuses, for a lifeline to pull himself out of the pit he had dug. But excuses sound hollow when the person who knows the truth stands on the other side of the line. Michael didn't let him regain footing. "You left your mother at a hospital like she was nothing," he said, measured, each syllable deliberate. "Do you know what that makes you, Daniel? Not strong, not independent, just small. A man who believes cruelty is power because he has never known what real power looks like." I saw Michael's knuckles tighten around the phone, though his voice remained even. "I left this family once," he continued. "That was my mistake. But you tried to erase your own mother. And that," his voice sharpened, cold as iron, "that's unforgivable." On the line, Daniel muttered something unintelligible, half protest, half plea. He sounded younger in that moment, stripped of the authority he liked to wield over me. My heart, even bruised as it was, recognized that voice. The little boy who once feared storms, who once clutched my hand when shadows frightened him. But compassion is not blindness. That boy was gone, buried under layers of entitlement and disdain. What remained was a man undone by the reappearance of a truth he thought safely buried. Michael lowered the phone slightly, letting Daniel's muffled stammer trail into static, then ended the call with a tap. The device went dark, and for a long moment, silence settled heavy between us. My pulse thundered in my ears. I had expected Daniel to react with anger, with arrogance, maybe even with laughter. But to hear fear, that was something else entirely. It was the sound of a mask slipping, the realization that his actions had witnesses now, that his cruelty no longer lived in the shadows. I exhaled slowly, the air trembling in my chest. For the first time in years, I felt the scales tilt, not fully, not yet, but enough to sense a shift. Daniel's grip on me had loosened, and in its place was something I never thought I'd feel again when it came to my son. His fear, not mine. With Michael's help, my life transformed, not in fireworks, but in the steady, unfurling way morning becomes day. He placed a small ring of keys in my palm, 3 silver teeth and 1 brass one, and the sound they made against each other chimed like a private promise. The little house he found for me sat on a quiet street where maples reached toward one another like neighbors gossiping over a fence. White siding, green shutters, a porch just wide enough for 2 chairs, and a table that could hold an open book and a glass of water. Out back, soil dark as coffee, a rectangle of possibility outlined by a sagging picket fence. A garden, yes, but also a boundary I could tend with my own hands. We walked the rooms in silence first, as if noise might startle the place. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon and old wood. Someone had left a single hook by the back door, a perfect place for my cardigan. The bedroom window faced east. The floorboards there carried a slight give that felt like patience rather than wear. Michael set the deed on the counter without theatrics, the contract weighty but not heavy, the ink still young enough to shine when it caught the light. "Yours," he said, "not ours. Not for now." The word placed a floor under me. He didn't flood me with pity, he refused to. Each morning for a while he checked in, coffee in hand, tie loosened, questions practical. "Do you like the mattress? Is the porch too bright at noon? Did the bank treat you with respect?" And then he'd leave me space to answer, space to figure out that my preferences were not an indulgence but a right. If I faltered and apologized for wanting the blue curtains rather than the top, he'd lift an eyebrow, amused, and remind me, "Dignity isn't a luxury, sis. It's the floor and the ceiling." We went to the bank together the first week. I sat across from a woman with a turquoise scarf and a nameplate that clicked when she typed. Michael didn't speak for me. He sat slightly back, a witness rather than a puppet master. I closed accounts that had been draining fees like slow leaks and opened ones that made sense. We set up direct deposits for the small streams of money I was entitled to and automatic cards to keep me from paying late penalties, wolves that had long learned the route to my door. I left the bank with a folder of plain facts and a tidy notebook I would use to record my choices, not my fears. That night, I put the folder in a drawer by the bed and slept with the simple knowledge that nothing, not even my savings, was waiting to ambush me. In the garden, I started small. Lettuce first, because it forgives clumsy hands. Then tomatoes, their seedlings delicate and brave, and marigolds along the edge to trick the pests and cheer me while they did it. The soil taught me what my body already knew. You dig, you water, you wait, and everything you think is gone is really rearranging itself, preparing to push back into the light. I kept a little spade by the back steps and a brush to clean dirt from my nails, a very specific kind of pride, the kind that doesn't care about anyone's permission. Neighbors appeared the way neighbors do, through the ritual of trash day and a wave that turned into conversation. Mrs. Keene, 2 doors down, leaned over her railing to ask if I'd grown tomatoes before. Only in buckets on a fire escape, I said, and she laughed like we'd just broken a code. A young couple jogged past late every afternoon. They slowed the first time to pet a cat that wasn't mine, and the second time to compliment my marigolds as if I painted them myself. No one asked what had happened to me. They asked what I was planting next. Word of Daniel's cruelty traveled without my help. The city is 1,000 small towns braided together by shared memory, and it remembers. I didn't repeat the story, but it rose anyway. In coffee shops, at office microwaves, in the soft murmur of after-work drinks. I overheard pieces in odd places, a cashier telling a coworker, "Can you imagine?" A woman at the pharmacy shaking her head over a headline someone read aloud from a phone. A man in line at the hardware store saying, "Not the kind of reputation you recover from." None of them knew the mother they were speaking of stood 3 feet away, debating which twine would best train the tomato vines. I didn't correct them or claim the role. I didn't need to. The truth was doing its own walking. Once at the market, I saw an old acquaintance of Daniel's, a colleague, maybe, who had always greeted me with brittle politeness, the kind people save for the help. He caught my eye and looked down quickly, a flush rising to his cheekbones, as if my presence indicted him, too. I wasn't unkind. I wasn't anything. I weighed peaches, pressed a thumb against one, and chose the freckled ones because they tasted better. It is its own kind of victory to be uninterested in the theater of someone else's shame. Michael brought me small, sensible gifts. Not jewelry or statements, but tools that implied a future of use. Pruning shears that fit my hand, a kneeling pad that made stubborn weeds negotiable, a lantern for the porch with a dimmer that settled the evening like a sigh. When he saw me fuss at the cost of a new pair of shoes, sturdy ones that wouldn't make my knees pay for my frugality later, he said, "You invested in Daniel for 35 years. It's time to diversify." He had a way of wrapping care in humor so it could be accepted without apology. Peace announced itself in my routines. I woke before dawn because the birds insisted. I brewed coffee strong enough to remember something and carried it to the porch. The street, still half asleep, smelled of wet leaves and distant toast. I read a few pages of a book without counting how many before giving myself permission to stop. I foamed no one out of obligation. When the sun broke over the maples and gilded the edges of everything it touched, it warmed my shins through the thin cotton of my robe and reminded me my body still liked the morning. The whispers that once sought me found Daniel instead. I didn't track them, but occasionally their shadows reached me and flickered across the porch floorboards, people withdrawing invitations, Teal's cooling, a mentor of his declining to take his calls as often. I didn't celebrate any of it. Schadenfreude curdles fast. What I felt was simpler. The scales resetting to zero, the ledger drawing a line across the page, the sense that consequences had finally been hooked to causes and would now travel together like proper companions. Freedom tastes different at 70 than it does at 20. It is less about noise and more about the absence of it. No waiting for a phone to vibrate with someone else's urgency. No calculating what tone will keep a fragile peace. No proofreading a text 6 times to slip past a landmine. In the steadiness, my own voice came back to me, not louder, just true. I found myself humming while I watered the tomatoes. I caught my reflection in the kitchen window and didn't flinch at the soft jowls, the silver at my temples. I noticed instead that my eyes had regained their depth, as if someone had opened the blinds from inside. On the porch at dawn, I stood barefoot and let the boards press a faint map into my soles. Sun climbed the porch rail and warmed my skin. The garden wore its morning dew like jewelry no one needed to envy. I thought of the years I had tied my worth to Daniel's approval, how each nod from him had functioned like a ration ticket I had to line up for. I thought of the ledger I had kept in my head, a 2-column accounting of sacrifice deposited and gratitude withdrawn. It was a habit, not a life. It ended here. I did not forgive and forget. I remembered and released. There is a difference, and it feels like oxygen. I gave thanks, not to any grand design, but to the ordinary mercies that had added up when I wasn't looking. A brother's return, a porch that faced the east, soil that kept its promises, a name written on a deed where mine had so often been omitted. Even my hands, veined and work-scarred, felt like proof of continuity rather than age. They had carried, stitched, scrubbed, soothed. Now they planted. Value, love, hope. At 70, they are not theories. They are verbs. I gave value to my time by spending it without apology. I let love be particular and local, coffee, marigolds, a chair pulled closer so morning could reach my knees. I tended hope the way you tend a garden, not by demanding blossoms, but by trusting the roots to do their slow, private work. When I breathed in, the air didn't ask me to justify my place in it. It accepted the exchange. I exhaled, and the day, indifferent to everything but light, began.